The little black girl cried to the biker, saying someone marked her route across the academy grounds. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin our story. It was an unusually quiet morning at the academy, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty grounds. The first signs of life appeared when a young girl, no older than 11, emerged from the gates of the school, her small frame barely visible as she ran down the path. Her braids bounced with each hurried step, and her heart pounded in her chest as she looked over her shoulder, afraid of what might be lurking behind her. She had always been a strong and brave child, but today was different. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and her every move felt like it was being tracked. As she ran, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps closing in, a chill creeping up her spine. She turned the corner quickly and, without thinking, ran straight towards the group of bikers parked at the edge of the street, their motorcycles standing tall like guardians in the early morning mist. The group of riders, a mix of men and women from all walks of life, had gathered for a charity event nearby. They were familiar faces, but today, they were about to become something far more important, her protectors. The girl's wide eyes locked onto one of the bikers, a tall man with a leather vest and a hard expression. His name was Jake, and he was known for his calm demeanor and unwavering sense of justice. She stumbled towards him, breathless and frantic, her voice shaking as she blurted out, "Someone's following me. Someone marked my route." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of fear. The bikers exchanged quick glances, the playful chatter of a moment ago disappearing into the tense silence that followed. Jake was the first to speak, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Stay with me, kid," he said, his hand gently resting on her shoulder as he turned to his fellow riders. They knew this wasn't just some random occurrence. This was a call for help, and they were ready to answer it. The girl, barely able to hold back tears, nodded, her body trembling from both fear and exhaustion. Jake took a deep breath, scanning the street for any sign of danger. "We'll take care of this. You're safe now." As the group of bikers prepared to follow the girl's lead, they couldn't help but wonder who could be behind this, marking her every step. The first clue had come from her frantic words, but they needed more, much more, to uncover the mystery that had turned an ordinary school morning into a terrifying nightmare. The bikers revved their engines, the sound echoing through the streets as they formed a protective circle around the girl, ready to face whatever danger lay ahead. They were about to uncover a secret that had been hiding in plain sight, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about safety, trust, and family. The chase had just begun. The group of bikers quickly fell into formation, their engines roaring to life as they followed the girl, whose eyes were wide with fear and uncertainty. Jake, the leader of the group, glanced back at his fellow riders and gave them a quick nod. This was no longer just a simple errand. They were diving headfirst into something far more dangerous. The girl's story had left too many unanswered questions, and Jake knew they needed answers, fast. "Stay close, everyone," he called out to his crew, his voice steady and commanding. "We move quickly and carefully. No mistakes." The group nodded in unison, a mix of veterans and newer riders, all bound by the same unspoken code: protect the innocent, no matter the cost. As the bikers followed the girl's directions, they found themselves weaving through quiet suburban streets, the sun slowly climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jake could feel the tension building in the air. There was something off about this entire situation. Whoever had marked the girl's route knew what they were doing. The fact that she had been followed, tracked even, raised alarms. They passed the local park, a few early risers jogging, oblivious to the unfolding drama just beyond their view. The girl, still clutching her breath, kept looking behind her, as though the shadows themselves were closing in. "How far?" Jake asked, his voice a calm anchor amid the rising chaos. The girl's voice trembled as she answered, "Not far. Just keep going straight." She was trying to hold it together, but it was clear she was terrified. Jake could see her hands shaking, her eyes darting back and forth, scanning the area around them. As they turned a corner, the scene in front of them shifted. What had once been a sleepy residential area gave way to an industrial zone, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. The mood changed instantly. "This is it," the girl said, pointing toward a large, rusted warehouse at the end of the street. Her voice was barely audible, but the fear in her eyes told Jake everything he needed to know. The girl had brought them to the heart of the danger. "This is where I was supposed to meet them," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jake's heart sank. The fact that she had been lured here meant someone had been watching her for a long time. They had known exactly where to find her, and now it was clear they were waiting for her to walk right into their trap. Jake pulled the throttle of his bike, urging it forward faster. The other bikers followed suit, and within moments, they were parked in front of the massive warehouse. The place looked abandoned, the windows covered with layers of dust, the doors slightly ajar. Jake's instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't just some random hideout. It was a place designed to intimidate, a place where people could disappear without a trace. He turned to his riders. "We stick together," he said firmly. "No one goes in alone." With that, they dismounted their bikes and moved toward the entrance, their boots making heavy thuds against the concrete. The sound echoed in the silent morning air. As they stepped closer to the door, they noticed something strange, a strange symbol painted in red on the ground just outside the warehouse. It looked like a snake wrapped around a skull, a symbol Jake had seen before. The Serpents, a notorious gang known for their ruthless tactics and connections to illegal operations. Jake had crossed paths with them once before, and it hadn't ended well. He exchanged a look with his crew, and without a word, they knew what was coming. "Stay alert," Jake whispered. The girl, her eyes wide with dread, stayed close to Jake's side, her small hand trembling in his as they moved inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the only light coming from flickering bulbs overhead. The air was thick with dust and the scent of something metallic, almost like rust. As they ventured deeper into the building, they heard a faint sound, a low hum that made the hairs on the back of Jake's neck stand up. It was the sound of voices, muffled but unmistakable. The bikers moved toward the noise, their hands instinctively reaching for the weapons they kept concealed in their jackets. The tension was unbearable, each step heavier than the last. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. Jake motioned for everyone to stop, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. He could sense someone, no, something, waiting in the shadows. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was there. They weren't alone. The girl gasped beside him, her grip tightening on his arm. "They're here," she whispered. Jake nodded, signaling for the group to spread out. They had come too far to turn back now. The hunt had begun. The moment Jake saw the shadow move, his instincts kicked in. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and his grip tightened on the handle of his bike. This wasn't just a warning anymore. They were in serious trouble. With the girl still by his side, trembling but staying close, he motioned for the others to spread out silently. The sound of boots on the concrete was muffled in the thick air, but Jake knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. His eyes darted around the dimly lit warehouse, scanning every corner, every possible hiding spot. He could feel the weight of the room, the eerie silence amplifying the soft hum of distant machinery. It was like stepping into the lion's den, knowing the predator was already watching you. The girl, her face pale with fear, clung to Jake's side as they slowly advanced deeper into the warehouse. Every step seemed to echo, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Her small hand gripped his, and she whispered, "They're here, they're waiting for us." Jake nodded, his voice low and steady. "We'll get you out of here, don't worry." But even as he spoke, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and a cold sense of dread washed over him. They weren't alone, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The deeper they ventured, the darker the room became. The flickering lights overhead were barely enough to illuminate the vast space, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with each passing second. Jake's eyes scanned the far corners of the warehouse, looking for anything that might give them a clue about who was behind this. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows. A tall man, wearing a dark jacket, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. Jake's gut twisted. This wasn't some random thug. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The girl gasped softly beside him, her voice trembling. That's him. That's the man who's been following me. The man didn't move at first, as if he was waiting for them to make the first move. But then, slowly, he stepped into the dim light, revealing a scar running down the side of his face. It was the kind of scar that spoke of years of violence, of someone who had been in the game for too long. Well, the man said, his voice rough and cold. Looks like you brought some company. Jake's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice calm. We're here for her, he said, his eyes never leaving the man's face. You need to let her go. The man chuckled darkly, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. You think I'm going to just let her walk out of here? You're in my territory now, and you don't get to make the rules. At his words, Jake's crew tensed. They weren't just dealing with some street thug. This was someone who was willing to make things violent, and Jake knew that the girl's life wasn't the only one at risk anymore. You don't want to do this, Jake warned, his hand inching toward the weapon tucked inside his jacket. The man's eyes flicked to the bikers surrounding him, and for a moment, he seemed to consider his options. Then, without warning, he stepped back, nodding to someone hidden in the shadows. I think it's too late for that, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Suddenly, the doors at the far end of the warehouse crashed open, and a group of men flooded in. They were all wearing the same symbol, the Serpents. Jake's heart sank. These were the people he had feared, the ones who had been lurking in the background, pulling the strings. There were at least a dozen of them, all armed and looking ready for a fight. The bikers stood their ground, weapons now fully visible, their eyes locked on the approaching gang. Jake looked down at the girl, her face pale with fear. Stay close, he whispered. She nodded, her body shaking but her determination shining through. She wasn't going to let fear control her. Not now. The Serpents closed in, their leader smirking as he walked toward Jake. You made a big mistake coming here, the man said, his voice dripping with venom. But I'm going to enjoy this. Let's see if you're as tough as they say you are. Without warning, the first punch was thrown, and chaos erupted. The bikers fought back with everything they had, their motorcycles roaring to life as they clashed with the gang. The girl clung to Jake's side, her eyes wide with fear, but filled with something else, hope. The bikers weren't just her protectors. They were her family now, and they weren't going to let anything happen to her. The fight raged on, the sound of fists connecting, boots pounding against the concrete, and the growls of engines drowning out everything else. Jake could barely keep up with the chaos, his focus solely on protecting the girl. He knew that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for something far bigger. The promise he had made to her father, the promise to keep her safe. As the fight reached its peak, Jake's eyes met the girl's, and for a brief moment, he saw the same determination in her eyes that he had seen in her father's. This was it. They were in this together, and nothing was going to stop them. The warehouse was filled with chaos. The sound of punches, motorcycles roaring, and shouts echoed off the cold concrete walls. Jake fought back-to-back with his crew, his eyes locked on the girl to ensure she stayed safe. His mind was focused on one thing: protecting her, no matter the cost. The Serpents were relentless, but the bikers were a force to be reckoned with. Jake had been through battles before, but this one felt different. This was about family. This was about keeping a promise. Jake took down one of the Serpents with a swift blow to the jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. He didn't even pause to look back before rushing to check on the girl. She was trembling, but she hadn't let go of his side. She was brave, and that was something Jake hadn't expected. Stay close, Jake said, his voice low and firm. She nodded, clutching onto his vest as they moved deeper into the warehouse. As the fight raged on, Jake saw one of the bikers, Diesel, struggling with two of the Serpents. Diesel was big, strong, but these guys were armed. Jake didn't hesitate. He charged forward, knocking one of the attackers to the ground with a powerful swing. Diesel grinned, barely able to catch his breath. Thanks, brother, Diesel said, slapping Jake's back. We've got to finish this. But the threat wasn't over. Another Serpent moved quickly toward the back of the warehouse. They're trying to make a run for it, Jake muttered under his breath. He didn't give it a second thought. He surged forward, leaving the girl with the rest of the group as he sprinted after the man. The serpent saw him coming and reached for a knife. Jake was faster. He tackled the man to the ground, the knife skidding away as he pinned him down. The man struggled beneath Jake, but he was no match for the biker. Jake's breath came fast, his heart pounding in his chest as he grabbed the man's collar. "Who sent you?" Jake demanded, his voice low and threatening. The serpent smirked, but there was fear in his eyes. "You'll never find out," he spat. Jake didn't waste another moment. He threw the man aside and stood up, scanning the room for any other threats. He spotted the girl, her eyes wide with fear as she clung to one of the bikers. "Is she safe?" Diesel asked, coming up beside Jake. Jake nodded, but his mind was still racing. There was something bigger going on here, something more dangerous than just a few gang members. And he needed to get to the bottom of it before anyone else got hurt. Jake turned to the girl, his face softening for just a moment. "You did good," he said, his voice calm. She gave him a small nod, but her eyes were still filled with worry. "I'm scared," she whispered. Jake's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to be so young and already caught up in something this terrifying. "I know," he said softly, "but you're not alone anymore. We'll get you through this." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension in the air. Jake looked at Diesel, who was already heading toward the door. "We need to get out of here, now," Diesel said urgently. Jake nodded. They had fought hard, but the real danger wasn't over. The police would be there soon, and they needed to leave before they got caught in the crossfire. Jake looked at the girl, his expression hardening. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady. She nodded, her hand gripping his jacket once more as they moved quickly toward the exit. The bikers moved in formation, covering each other as they made their way through the back of the warehouse and out into the alley. Jake's mind raced. Who was behind this? Who had sent the serpents after the girl? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop until he got them. The police cars were getting closer, their sirens wailing in the distance. Jake and his crew didn't stop. They kept moving, the rumble of their motorcycles filling the air as they sped through the streets, determined to get the girl to safety. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jake finally slowed down, glancing over at the girl. She was still shaken, but she had stopped crying. For the first time, she looked up at him with a faint sense of hope. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice calm. The girl nodded, her grip loosening just a little. Jake didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone harm her. Not on his watch. Not ever. As the group of bikers sped down the highway, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the winding road. The wind whipped through Jake's hair as he rode at the front of the pack, his focus sharp. The girl, still clinging to him, had grown quieter since their escape from the warehouse. Jake could tell she was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but there was a new strength in her eyes. Hope, even if it was faint. They had made it out of the worst situation, but Jake knew they weren't safe yet. His mind raced as he thought back to the serpents, to the men who had tried to take the girl and what they were after. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the danger was far from over. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jake slowed down, the other bikers following his lead. He turned to the girl, who had finally stopped shaking, but her eyes were still filled with worry. "We're almost there," he reassured her, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. The girl nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. She had been through too much, and the journey wasn't over. As they neared the safety of the biker clubhouse, Jake's thoughts turned to the girl's family. He had promised her father that he would protect her, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't know the full story. Who were the serpents? And why had they targeted this girl? He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were just out of reach. The group arrived at the clubhouse, and Jake dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. The others followed suit, the sound of their motorcycles quieting as they parked. The clubhouse was a safe haven, a place where the bikers could regroup and plan their next move. But Jake knew they had no time to waste. The girl needed answers, and so did he. As they walked toward the front door, Diesel, who had been riding at the back of the pack, caught up with Jake. "You think they'll come after us again?" Diesel asked, his voice low and serious. Jake didn't hesitate. "They will," he said, his tone firm. "The serpents don't give up that easily." Inside the clubhouse, the other members of the crew were already gathered around a table, discussing the next steps. Jake led the girl to a chair, making sure she was comfortable before taking a seat himself. "We need to figure out who's behind this," Jake said, his voice steady. "We've got to know why they're targeting her." The room fell silent as everyone exchanged looks. No one had the answers yet, but they all knew the stakes were high. The girl had been through hell, and Jake wasn't about to let anyone hurt her again. As the bikers began to strategize, the girl spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. "I know why they're after me," she said softly. "It's because of my dad." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been wondering about the girl's father since they first met, but now he was hearing something he hadn't expected. The girl continued, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. "My dad used to be in a gang. He left when I was little, but I think they want to get to him through me." Jake leaned forward, his attention fully on the girl. "Do you know who they are?" The girl nodded, but she didn't speak for a moment. "The Serpents," she whispered. "They've been looking for my dad for years. He's been in hiding, and I think they know he's trying to start a new life." The weight of her words hit Jake like a ton of bricks. It was worse than he had imagined. The Serpents weren't just a local gang. They were connected to something much bigger. Jake's mind began to race again. If the Serpents were really after her father, they wouldn't stop until they had him. And if they had to go through her to get to him, they wouldn't hesitate. The room grew tense as the bikers processed the girl's words. Diesel was the first to speak. "We're not letting them get away with this," he said, his voice full of conviction. Jake nodded in agreement. "We'll protect her," he said. "But we need to find her dad. And we need to do it fast." The group spent the next few hours piecing together what they knew. They went over old contacts, dug through records, and contacted people who might have information on the girl's father's whereabouts. But as the night wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The Serpents were closing in, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Finally, just as the clock struck midnight, one of the bikers came through with a lead. "We've got a location," he said, holding up a piece of paper with an address. "It's an old storage facility on the edge of town. Looks like it's been abandoned for years." Jake stood up, his resolve hardening. "That's where they'll be," he said. "Let's go." With a sense of urgency, the bikers geared up and revved their engines. They weren't about to let the Serpents win this time. They were going to take the fight to them, and they weren't going to stop until the girl was safe and her father was found. The sound of the bikes filled the night air as they sped off toward the storage facility. The girl, still shaken but determined, rode alongside Jake, her grip tight on his vest. Jake could feel her fear, but he knew she was strong. They all were. This was far from over, but with the bikers by her side, the girl had hope again. And that hope would carry them through whatever came next. The ride to the old storage facility was tense, the air thick with anticipation and a sense of urgency. Jake kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He could feel the girl's presence beside him, her small hand gripping his vest tightly. He knew she was scared, but she was also determined, and that gave him hope. The other bikers followed closely behind, their engines roaring like a wave crashing through the quiet night. The sound of their bikes echoed off the empty streets, growing louder as they neared the facility. The storage area was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by an industrial wasteland of abandoned buildings and forgotten warehouses. The facility itself was large, its rusted gates standing tall like silent sentinels. It had been years since anyone had used it, but Jake had no doubt that the Serpents were making their move. As they pulled up to the gates, Jake signaled for the group to stop. The bikers dismounted quickly, their boots hitting the ground with purpose. The air was heavy with tension as they looked around, scanning their surroundings for any sign of movement. The girl stood close to Jake, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of determination in them as well. She wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. Jake turned to the others, his voice low and calm. "We move in together. Stay sharp and watch each other's backs." They nodded, ready for whatever came next. The group approached the facility, moving silently but swiftly. The moonlight cast long shadows over the ground, and the quiet was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the distant hum of the city. The front gate was locked, but it was nothing Jake couldn't handle. With a swift motion, he picked the lock, and they slipped through the opening. Inside, the facility was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust and the scent of rusted metal. Jake led the way, his senses on high alert. The place felt abandoned, but he knew better. The Serpents had a way of making places like this their own, hiding in plain sight. The group moved through the building, each step calculated, each sound magnified. They passed rows of empty storage units, the doors hanging loosely on their hinges. It was as if time had stood still here, but Jake knew that wasn't the case. They were in enemy territory now, and danger was lurking around every corner. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A door creaked open in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Jake's hand went to his side, ready for whatever was coming. The bikers followed his lead, falling into formation as they crouched down, blending into the shadows. Jake's heart raced. He knew the Serpents were here. They had to be. And if they were, they weren't alone. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, out of the shadows, emerged a man wearing a leather jacket with the familiar serpent insignia. He looked like he'd been waiting for them, his expression cold and calculating. "I knew you'd come," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you're too late." Jake's pulse quickened as he studied the man. This wasn't just some lackey. This was one of the leaders of the Serpents, and he knew exactly who Jake was. "Where's the girl's father?" Jake demanded, his voice steady but filled with authority. The Serpent leader chuckled darkly, stepping closer. "You really think you can just walk in here and take him?" he sneered. "You're out of your league, biker. We own this town, and you're just a few strays who think they can make a difference." Jake didn't flinch. He had faced worse, and he wasn't going to back down now. "You're going to let her father go," Jake said firmly, "or I'll make sure you regret it." The leader's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You really think you can scare me?" He nodded to someone behind Jake. The sound of doors opening filled the air, and suddenly, a dozen more Serpents emerged from the shadows, all armed and ready to fight. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Jake's crew stood ready, their fists clenched, their eyes locked on their enemies. But it wasn't just about a fight anymore. This was about sending a message. "We're not leaving without him," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "And if you want to try and stop us, we'll take you down, one by one." The Serpent leader hesitated, his gaze flicking to the rest of his men. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then, he barked out an order. "Take them." The Serpents rushed forward, weapons raised, and the fight was on. Jake's crew was ready, though. They were fast, coordinated, and fiercely loyal to one another. The clash of fists and the sound of chains and knives filled the air as the bikers fought back with everything they had. Jake, moving like lightning, took down the first Serpent with a swift punch to the jaw. He didn't wait for the next one to get close. With his other hand, he grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it at another attacker, knocking him out cold. The girl watched in awe, her heart pounding, but she didn't move. She knew Jake was doing everything to protect her. She knew they wouldn't stop until they got her father back. The fight raged on, but Jake felt the tide starting to turn in their favor. The Serpents were strong, but the bikers were united. And together, they were unstoppable. The battle raged on inside the abandoned storage facility, the air thick with tension and the sound of fists connecting with flesh. Jake fought with precision, each move calculated, his eyes locked onto his target. The Serpents were tough, but they were no match for the bikers. Jake had seen enough fights to know that when you had the right people by your side, you couldn't lose. The girl stood at the edge of the chaos, her heart racing, her grip still tight on Jake's vest. She watched as the bikers took down one Serpent after another, their movements swift and relentless. She could see the determination in their eyes, the fierce protectiveness that burned in their hearts. The Serpent leader, who had been barking orders moments before, now looked panicked. His men were falling one by one, and the bikers showed no signs of slowing down. Jake caught sight of him, his cold eyes locked onto the leader. "You made a big mistake," Jake muttered under his breath as he moved toward the leader. The man's expression shifted from confidence to fear as he saw Jake closing in. "You're finished," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with authority. The leader reached for his weapon, a gun tucked into his waistband, but before he could draw it, Jake was on him. With a swift motion, Jake knocked the gun from the leader's hand, sending it skidding across the floor. The man stumbled back, his face twisted in anger and fear. "You think you've won?" The leader sneered, but Jake's eyes were unwavering. "You're done," Jake said, his voice low and final. Before the leader could respond, One of the bikers grabbed him from behind, holding him in place. "We've got him," the biker said, his grip tight on the leader's arms. Jake looked around at the fallen serpents, his heart still racing. They had won, but the victory didn't feel complete. "Not yet. Where's her father?" Jake demanded, his eyes locked on the leader. The serpent's gaze flickered to the side, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw a glimmer of fear in his eyes. "He's not here," the leader spat, his voice filled with venom. "You think we'd just leave him lying around?" Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to let this man off that easily. "Tell me where he is," Jake growled, his voice low with intensity. The leader sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You really think you can stop us?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're too late. We've already won." The words stung, but Jake wasn't going to be swayed. He could feel the weight of the girl's eyes on him, and he knew he couldn't let her down now. "Tell me where he is," Jake repeated, his voice colder this time. The leader's smile faded as he looked around at the bikers, the fear in his eyes growing. He wasn't going to win this battle. He had lost, and he knew it. Finally, he relented. "Fine," the leader spat. "He's at the old mill on the outskirts of town. That's where we were taking him." Jake's heart raced. The mill. It was a familiar place, one that had been abandoned for years, a perfect hideout for people who didn't want to be found. But now it was the place where the girl's father was being held. Jake didn't hesitate. "Let's go," he said, his voice filled with urgency. The bikers moved quickly, disarming the remaining serpents and making sure they were restrained. The girl, still by Jake's side, looked up at him, her face filled with hope. "We're going to get him back," Jake said, his voice soft but firm. She nodded, the fear in her eyes replaced by a glimmer of determination. The group of bikers mounted their motorcycles once again, the engines roaring to life as they sped out of the facility and toward the mill. The ride was fast, the wind whipping past them as they cut through the night. The girl clung to Jake, her small form pressed against his back as they raced toward their destination. They had no time to waste. The serpents were getting desperate, and Jake knew they had to move quickly if they wanted to save the girl's father. As they approached the mill, the moonlight cast an eerie glow over the abandoned building. It loomed ahead, dark and silent, a place that seemed to breathe danger. Jake's gut tightened. This was it. They had to be ready for anything. He signaled for the bikers to stop, and they did, quickly and silently. The group dismounted and crept toward the mill, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. Jake's eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. He could feel the tension building, the anticipation in the air. The girl's father was in there, and they weren't leaving without him. As they approached the door, Jake signaled for the group to stop. He reached for the handle, and with a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The hinges creaked in protest, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then, out of the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was the girl's father, his hands bound, and a look of relief crossing his face as he saw the bikers. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I knew you would." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had done it. They had found him. But the danger was far from over. The serpents were still out there, and the battle wasn't won yet. But for now, the girl's father was safe. And that was all that mattered. The group of bikers stood in the darkened mill, the girl's father now safe, but still visibly shaken. His hands were bound, and his face was bruised, but the relief in his eyes was clear when he saw his daughter. She rushed to him, her small arms wrapping around him, tears of relief streaming down her face. Jake watched from a distance, his heart swelling at the sight. They had done it. They had brought the girl's father back. But the job wasn't done yet. The serpents weren't going to let this go. The danger wasn't over. Jake turned to his crew, his voice steady but firm. "We need to move. The serpents won't let this slide, and we're not staying here to find out what happens next." Diesel nodded, already looking toward the door. "We ride, we stay low. No one gets left behind." The bikers gathered their things quickly. The girl's father was weak, but he was able to stand with his daughter's help. She supported him as they moved toward the door, her hand wrapped around his arm tightly. They had to get out before anyone else showed up. As Jake led the group back outside, the sounds of the night seemed too quiet, too still. The moonlight reflected off the rusted buildings of the mill, casting long shadows across the ground. Jake's eyes scanned the area. He felt the tension in the air, the feeling of being watched. They weren't alone. The moment they stepped out of the door, the sound of a car engine revved in the distance, and Jake knew. "Get to the bikes," he shouted, motioning for everyone to move faster. The Serpents were closing in. The bikers sprinted toward their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life as they mounted their bikes. The girl's father struggled to keep up, but his daughter wouldn't let him fall behind. She stayed close, guiding him to the bike where Jake was already waiting. "Come on, we've got to move," Jake urged, his voice full of urgency. The girl's father climbed onto the bike behind Jake, his grip shaky but strong. The bikers revved their engines, ready to go, but the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder. It wasn't just one car this time. They were surrounded. Jake's heart raced as he turned his bike toward the road, the other bikers quickly following his lead. The Serpents had been waiting for this moment, and now they were making their move. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as the Serpents sped toward them, the headlights of their vehicles cutting through the darkness. Jake didn't hesitate. He gunned the engine, and the roar of his bike echoed as they sped off into the night. The other bikers followed, their engines roaring behind them. The girl clung to her father, her small arms wrapped tightly around him as they sped through the empty streets. They were in the middle of a high-speed chase, but Jake knew that no matter how fast they went, they couldn't outrun the danger. The Serpents were relentless. As they tore through the city streets, the headlights of the Serpent cars grew closer. Jake's eyes flicked to his rearview mirror, seeing the cars closing in. They couldn't keep this up forever. "We need to lose them," Jake muttered under his breath. Diesel, riding beside him, heard him and nodded. "I know a way," he said, his voice calm and confident. "Follow me." Jake trusted Diesel. He didn't hesitate as Diesel peeled off to the side, cutting through an alley. The other bikers followed suit, the group splitting up to lose the Serpents in the maze of streets and alleys. The girl's father, holding on tight, looked over at Jake, his face pale but grateful. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "You don't know what this means." Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "We're not out of danger yet," he said, his voice firm. "But we're getting you out of here. Hang tight." The chase continued, the Serpents relentless as they pursued the bikers through the city. The streets were becoming more familiar now, the sounds of their engines echoing off the walls of the narrow alleys. Jake glanced over at Diesel, who was leading the way through the winding paths, weaving in and out of traffic with expert precision. "This is it," Diesel called out as he took another sharp turn, leading them toward the outskirts of town. They had made it out of the heart of the city, but the Serpents were still hot on their trail. Jake's pulse quickened as he pushed his bike harder, the wind rushing past him, his focus narrowed. They were almost there. Just a little further, and they'd be free. The bike roared beneath him as they sped toward the open road. In the distance, Jake could see the lights of the town fading away, the road ahead dark and empty. They were getting close to the border of the town. It was only a matter of time before the Serpents gave up, or at least lost them. As the bikers reached the edge of town, they slowed down, their bikes now cruising along the quieter, safer road. The girl looked back, her eyes wide, her heart still racing. But for the first time that night, she smiled. They had made it. And as the bikers continued their ride into the night, they knew one thing for certain. They had fought for something worth saving, and they weren't going to stop until the girl and her father were completely safe. The bikes roared down the road, the wind whipping past them as they rode further from the city. The danger still loomed large in the rearview mirror, but as the bikers continued their journey into the night, the tension in the air began to dissipate. They had managed to shake the Serpents for now, but Jake knew it wasn't over. They had a long ride ahead of them before they could truly relax. The girl's father was still holding on tight to the back of Jake's bike, but his grip was firmer now, his strength returning. The girl, riding just behind her father, had a sense of calm in her eyes, though there was still a shadow of fear lingering there. She knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The road ahead stretched out like an endless ribbon of darkness, and every twist and turn seemed to hold the possibility of another danger. But for now, they were safe. They were moving fast, and the Serpents couldn't keep up with them. Jake's mind raced as he thought about the events that had led them to this moment. He had made a promise to the girl's father years ago, and now that promise was being tested in ways he hadn't imagined. But he wasn't about to break it. Not now. Not ever. As the bikers continued their ride, Jake's eyes flicked to the girl's father, who was now looking around, his expression filled with uncertainty. The father was a man who had been through a lot, a man who had tried to escape the past and build a better life for his family. But the serpents had dragged him back into a world he thought he'd left behind. Jake knew it wasn't just about saving the girl anymore. It was about giving the father a chance at redemption. Jake turned his focus back to the road, his grip tightening on the handlebars. The ride was long, but they needed to get as far as possible before the serpents found them again. "We need to find a safe place," Jake said, his voice carrying over the sound of the engines. Diesel, riding just behind him, nodded. "I know a spot," he said. "It's an old campground a few miles up the road. We can lay low there for a while." Jake gave him a brief nod, signaling to the others that they were taking a detour. The road leading to the campground was secluded, surrounded by trees and hills that offered the perfect cover. It wasn't much, but it was a safe haven for the time being. The group slowed down as they turned off the main road, heading into the wooded area. The gravel path crunched beneath the tires, and the air grew cooler as they left the main highway behind. After a few minutes of winding through the trees, the campground came into view, just as Diesel had promised. It was a small, quiet place, long forgotten by most, but perfect for what they needed. They parked the bikes near the edge of the site, the faint glow of the moon casting long shadows over the dirt and grass. Jake dismounted, taking a deep breath. The night was peaceful here, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. It was hard to believe they had just been fighting for their lives hours before. The girl and her father climbed off the bike, both of them looking around in awe at the quiet surroundings. For a moment, it seemed like they could finally breathe, like the weight of everything that had happened was starting to lift. But Jake knew better. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. They were safe for now, but the serpents wouldn't stop looking for them. He turned to the others, his voice low but firm. "We need to keep watch. Don't get too comfortable. They'll be coming for us, and we need to be ready." Diesel nodded, already pulling out his phone to check for any updates. The bikers set up camp, making sure their bikes were hidden from sight and that there were no signs of their presence. They gathered around a small fire, the crackling flames casting a warm glow on their faces. The girl sat with her father, the two of them speaking in hushed tones. Jake gave them space, knowing the reunion was important. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the serpents. They were persistent, and they had resources. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What if the serpents knew where they were? What if they had already set up a trap? The thought gnawed at him. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not when they were so close to finding a way out of this nightmare. He looked up at the stars, the cold night air filling his lungs. They had come so far, but the fight wasn't over. The girl's father had been through hell, and so had she. They deserved a chance to start over. Jake was going to make sure they got it, no matter what it took. He turned back to the fire, his gaze resting on his crew. They were family, and they would stand by him until the very end. "We stick together," he said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "No matter what comes next, we don't leave anyone behind." Diesel gave him a small smile, the others nodding in agreement. It wasn't just a promise. It was a vow. The bikers had fought through everything to get this far, and they weren't going to stop now. They would fight until the very end. And no one, not even the serpents, could take that away from them. The night passed quietly, but the sense of impending danger still hung heavily in the air. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the serpents found them. He lay awake, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the campfire, his mind racing. The others were sleeping, but his thoughts were consumed with what came next. The girl and her father were safe for now, but for how long? He had made a promise to her father years ago, and now, in the midst of all this chaos, he was determined to keep it. He couldn't allow the serpents to destroy the chance they had at a new life. The sound of tires crunching against gravel broke his thoughts, and Jake sat up quickly, alert. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the dark surroundings. The campfire had died down to a faint glow, and the world around them felt eerily silent. Jake stood up slowly, motioning for the others to wake. "We've got company," he whispered. The bikers, instantly on alert, began to gather their things, eyes darting around the campsite, watching for any signs of movement. Diesel, who had been keeping watch, stepped forward. "It's a car," he said, his voice steady. They're coming this way. Jake's heart sank. He had hoped the Serpents wouldn't find them, but it seemed that hope was quickly fading. The group moved swiftly, making sure they were ready for whatever was coming. Jake grabbed his helmet and threw it on, glancing toward the girl and her father. They were still sitting by the edge of the fire, looking up at him with wide eyes. The girl's father stood up, his face drawn, but there was a sense of strength in him now that hadn't been there before. Jake walked over to him, keeping his voice low. You need to stay hidden, Jake said. Don't come out unless I tell you to. Understand? The man nodded, but Jake could see the worry in his eyes. He wasn't used to being the one who needed protecting, but right now, that was exactly what was happening. The bikers spread out, taking positions behind trees and rocks, ready for a confrontation. The sound of the approaching car grew louder, and Jake could feel the tension in the air. They were closing in. Stay sharp, Jake said. This could be it. The car appeared around the bend, its headlights cutting through the dark forest like a pair of eyes searching for them. Jake's grip tightened on his bike's handlebar, but he didn't move. He knew they had to remain hidden, wait for the right moment. As the car slowed down, it stopped just outside the edge of the camp. The headlights went out, plunging the area into darkness. The doors creaked open, and figures stepped out. Jake's heart pounded as he recognized the men. They were wearing the familiar jackets of the Serpents. The moment they stepped onto the gravel, the bikers tensed. Jake knew they had to act quickly. He nodded at Diesel, who gave him a brief but understanding look. Without a word, Diesel moved forward, his large frame blending into the shadows. Jake followed close behind, his eyes locked on the Serpents. He couldn't let them get any closer. We need to make them think we're not here, Jake muttered. Get ready. Diesel positioned himself to the right of the group, and Jake moved to the left. The rest of the bikers flanked them, creating a wide circle. They knew they were outnumbered, but they weren't going down without a fight. The Serpents weren't expecting an ambush, and that gave them the advantage. The group of bikers held their breath as the Serpents began to move around, their voices low but menacing. They've got to be around here somewhere, one of the Serpents said, his voice gruff. Keep your eyes peeled. The others nodded, their steps heavy as they moved deeper into the camp. Jake could hear their boots crunching against the gravel, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they stumbled into the trap. The tension was unbearable. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement felt like it could trigger a fight. Jake's hand hovered near the handle of his weapon, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Then, the Serpent closest to him turned, taking a few more steps toward a patch of trees. That was when Jake made his move. With lightning speed, he lunged forward, his fist connecting with the Serpent's jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. The fight erupted immediately, chaos filling the air as the bikers and the Serpents clashed. Jake fought with precision, his movements smooth and controlled, the training kicking in as he took down one Serpent after another. Diesel was at his side, taking on 2 men at once with a fierce intensity. The others followed, each biker fighting with everything they had. The Serpents, caught off guard by the sudden attack, scrambled to react. But it was too late. The bikers had the upper hand. The girl's father, hidden behind a tree, watched the fight unfold, his heart racing. He had never seen anything like it, but he knew he was safe. Jake was protecting him, protecting his daughter, and that was all that mattered. The fight was intense, but it was clear that the Serpents were losing. One by one, the bikers overpowered them, their strength and coordination proving too much. After what felt like an eternity, the last of the Serpents were subdued, lying on the ground in defeat. Jake stood, breathing heavily, scanning the area for any more threats. The battle was over. For now, they had won. Jake turned to the others, his voice calm but firm. We need to go. Now. Without hesitation, the bikers gathered their things, mounting their motorcycles and preparing to leave the camp. The girl and her father climbed onto Jake's bike once again, ready to move. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they had made it through another fight. And with the bikers by their side, they knew they weren't alone. Together, they would face whatever came next. The road ahead was dark and desolate, the only sounds the low hum of the engines and the distant howl of the wind. The group of bikers rode in formation, their bikes cutting through the night like a razor. Jake led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the road, watching for any signs of danger. The girl and her father rode close behind him, the girl's small hands gripping her father tightly as they bounced over the uneven terrain. The weight of what had happened still hung heavily on them all, but there was a sense of relief too. They had made it this far, and the worst was behind them. But Jake knew they couldn't afford to relax just yet. The Serpents wouldn't give up easily. He had to keep pushing forward, keep moving, or they would find themselves trapped again. As they neared a small town, Jake slowed his bike. The others followed suit, the engines rumbling to a soft purr as they rolled into the outskirts of town. The streetlights flickered dimly in the distance, casting long shadows on the ground. It was a quiet town, a place where they could lay low for a while. Jake signaled for the group to stop. "We'll stay here for a bit," he said, his voice low but firm. "Lay low, regroup, and figure out our next move." Diesel nodded, glancing around the empty streets. "No sign of anyone following us yet," he said, his voice steady. "But we can't let our guard down." The bikers dismounted, the sound of their boots hitting the pavement echoing through the quiet town. The girl and her father climbed off the bike, and Jake saw the exhaustion in their faces. They had been through a lot in the past few days, and he knew they needed rest. But even more than that, they needed answers. Jake turned to the girl's father. "We've made it this far," Jake said, his voice calm. "But I need you to tell me everything. About the Serpents. About why they're after you." The girl's father hesitated, looking down at his hands for a moment. Then he took a deep breath and looked Jake in the eye. "They're not just a gang," he said, his voice low and filled with a quiet rage. "They're part of something bigger. They've been involved in all kinds of illegal operations, weapons, drugs, you name it. When I left, they didn't take kindly to it. They've been hunting me ever since." Jake's jaw tightened. He knew the Serpents were dangerous, but he hadn't realized just how deep their reach went. "So they've been after you for years?" Jake asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The girl's father nodded. "Ever since I walked away. I thought they'd leave me alone, but they've been biding their time. Now they've found me again, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Jake clenched his fists. "What do they want?" The man paused, glancing over at his daughter. "They want me back in the fold," he said quietly. "But more than that, they want control. Power. They think they can intimidate me, make me do what they want. And now, they're using my daughter to get to me." The girl's eyes widened, and Jake could see the fear in her expression. She had no idea how much danger she was really in. Jake's heart hardened. He wasn't about to let the Serpents get away with this. "You won't have to worry about them anymore," Jake said firmly. "We'll take care of it." The girl's father looked up, his face filled with gratitude but also a sense of deep concern. "I don't want to put you all at risk," he said, his voice wavering. "You've already done so much." Jake shook his head. "We don't leave our own behind. You and your daughter are under our protection now, and that means we're going to make sure the Serpents never threaten you again." Diesel stepped forward, his expression hard. "We've got a few old friends who owe us some favors. If we're going to take the fight to the Serpents, we need to gather intel. We'll track them down, find out where they're hiding, and hit them hard." Jake nodded, the plan starting to form in his mind. "We move quickly. No waiting around. We hit them before they even know what's coming." The group gathered around, their faces serious as they began to make plans. The girl's father, though reluctant, agreed to help where he could. He wasn't a fighter, but he knew the Serpents better than anyone, and his knowledge was invaluable. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The bikers knew this would be their toughest fight yet, but they were ready. They had come too far to back down now. As the night wore on, the group worked in silence, preparing for the next stage of their mission. Jake could feel the weight of what was to come, but he also felt something else, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for a stranger. He was fighting for a family, and that was something worth dying for. The Serpents wouldn't win. Not this time. The hours passed quickly as the bikers prepared for what would be their most intense mission yet. The plans were laid out, the strategy set, and the group was ready to take the fight to the Serpents. Jake knew they had to act fast. The longer they waited, the more time the Serpents had to regroup, and the closer they came to endangering the girl and her father once again. Diesel, who had taken charge of gathering intel, approached Jake with a look of determination. "I've got something," he said. "A contact who's been watching the Serpents. They've been moving their operations around, trying to stay one step ahead. But I've got a location." Jake turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Where?" Diesel handed him a piece of paper with a set of coordinates. An old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's where they've been storing weapons. They're planning something big. Jake's mind raced as he thought about the possibilities. This was their chance to strike before the Serpents could organize. He looked around at the group of bikers, each one ready to fight. "We're moving out," Jake said. "Get your gear and your heads in the game. We take this warehouse, we send a message." The group geared up quickly, the sound of leather jackets being zipped and helmets being adjusted filling the air. The girl and her father stood off to the side, watching as the bikers prepared. The girl's father, though grateful for the protection, still looked uneasy. He had lived his life in hiding, always looking over his shoulder, and now, with the Serpents closing in, it felt like everything was crashing down around him. Jake noticed his discomfort and walked over to him. "You're doing the right thing," Jake said, his voice steady. "You're protecting your daughter. We'll finish this." The man nodded, though his expression remained tense. "I don't know if I can ever fully escape them," he said softly. "They've got too many people, too many connections." Jake gave him a firm look. "You're not in this alone anymore. We've got your back." The group of bikers mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life as they sped out of the quiet town and onto the road. The drive was fast, the wind biting through their jackets as they cut through the night. Jake led the way, his mind focused on the mission ahead. The warehouse loomed in the distance as they neared their destination. It was dark and isolated, tucked away behind a line of trees. Jake's gut tightened. This was it. The Serpents were here. They weren't just dealing with a gang anymore. They were dealing with a network of criminals, each one willing to do whatever it took to keep their power. Jake had seen this kind of thing before, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. As they pulled up to the warehouse, the group slowed, keeping their distance. The last thing they needed was to walk into a trap. Diesel and a few of the other bikers dismounted first, taking positions around the perimeter of the warehouse to keep watch. Jake gave them a quick nod. "Move in," he said, his voice low but urgent. The bikers crept toward the entrance of the warehouse, their movements swift and quiet. Jake led the way, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The last thing they wanted was to walk into a fight they weren't prepared for. The warehouse was eerily silent as they approached, the door hanging slightly ajar. Jake could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation thick as they neared their target. Diesel took the lead, pushing the door open slowly. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a few broken windows. The smell of dust and stale air filled Jake's nostrils as he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The group spread out, checking every corner, every shadow, looking for any signs of the Serpents or their operation. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. In the far corner of the warehouse, stacked high against the walls, were crates filled with weapons. Jake's heart sank. This was bigger than he had imagined. The Serpents were planning something serious, something that could put a lot of lives at risk. He motioned for Diesel to come over, and together they examined the crates. "They've been stockpiling," Diesel said, his voice grim. "This is bad, Jake. They've got enough firepower here to take down half the town." Jake clenched his jaw. "We can't let them get away with this." He turned to his crew, his voice low but commanding. "We need to destroy these weapons. Send a message that the Serpents are done." The bikers set to work, moving swiftly and efficiently. Diesel and Jake made their way through the warehouse, setting fire to the crates and lighting the fuse on explosive charges. The crackling sound of fire filled the air as the weapons went up in flames. It was a small victory, but it felt like a step in the right direction. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the safety of the girl and her father, for everyone who would be affected by the Serpents' operations. As the last of the weapons exploded in a burst of flames, the bikers made their way to the exit, their mission complete. But as Jake stepped outside, he felt the weight of what was to come. The Serpents weren't going to just roll over after this. They'd be back, and they'd be angrier than ever. But Jake wasn't afraid. They had done what needed to be done, and they were ready for whatever came next. The fire had burned out, leaving behind a trail of smoke that lingered in the cold night air. Jake stood in the distance, watching the smoldering remains of the Serpents' weapons. The explosion had sent a message, loud and clear. The Serpents were strong, but they were not invincible. The bikers had taken the fight to them, and it felt like a small victory in a long battle. But Jake knew this wasn't over. The Serpents would come back, and next time, They wouldn't be so careless. Jake walked over to Diesel, who was standing by the bikes, scanning the road. "It's not over, is it?" Jake asked. Diesel glanced at him, his expression serious. "No, it's not," he said quietly. "But we've made a dent. We've got their attention now." Jake nodded, his thoughts drifting to the girl and her father. They had made it this far, but the danger still hung over them like a storm cloud. The Serpents wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jake turned to look at the girl, who was sitting with her father by one of the bikes, her face pale, but filled with determination. She had been through so much, and yet she was still standing. Her father, though visibly shaken, had regained some of his strength. He had a long road ahead of him, but with the bikers' help, he would get there. Jake approached them, his voice calm but firm. "We've hit them hard," Jake said, "but we need to keep moving. The Serpents will regroup, and we need to be ready when they do." The girl's father nodded, looking at Jake with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I don't want to keep putting you all in danger," he said. "We've already come so far. Maybe it's time for us to disappear for good." Jake looked at him, his expression unreadable. He understood the man's fear, but Jake also knew that running wasn't the answer. "You can't hide forever," Jake said. "The Serpents will always find you. But we're not running anymore. We're fighting." The girl's father met his gaze, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He was tired of running, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to fight for the life he wanted. "What do we do now?" the girl's father asked. "We stick together," Jake said. "We keep moving, keep hitting them hard until they know we're not going anywhere." The group of bikers had become a family over the past few days, and Jake was determined to keep them that way. They had fought for something more than just survival. They had fought for each other. Jake turned to Diesel, who was still standing watch by the bikes. "We need to head to the safe house," Jake said. "It's not much, but it's a place to regroup." Diesel nodded, and the rest of the bikers mounted their bikes, starting them up one by one. The group rode out of the area, their motorcycles cutting through the quiet night. As they passed through small towns and empty highways, Jake felt the weight of their mission pressing down on him. The Serpents would regroup, but so would they. They would rebuild, and when the time came, they would finish this fight. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. They rode for hours, the moon hanging high in the sky as they made their way to the safe house. The place was secluded, a small cabin tucked away in the woods, far from the chaos they had just left behind. The girl and her father climbed off the bike first, looking around in awe at the quiet surroundings. It was far from perfect, but it was safe, at least for now. "This is home for the time being," Jake said as he dismounted. "We'll keep watch, regroup, and figure out our next move." The group set up camp in the small cabin, settling in for the night. The girl's father went to rest in one of the back rooms, while the girls sat by the fire with the bikers. The night was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, the tension seemed to fade. But Jake knew it wouldn't last. They had made it this far, but the Serpents were still out there. They had sent a message, but it wasn't over. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the woods outside. The night was still, but he knew that at any moment, the storm could come again. He wasn't going to let his guard down. Not yet. Not until the fight was over. He turned away from the window, walking over to the girl and her father. "You're safe here," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But we're not finished yet. We'll make sure the Serpents don't get to you. Not now, not ever." The girl nodded, her face full of quiet determination. She had seen the worst, but she wasn't going to let it define her. She was ready to fight, too. And with Jake and the bikers by her side, she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. The fight wasn't over, but they had a family, and together, they would keep fighting until the Serpents were nothing more than a memory. In these gripping Hell Angels stories, a young girl and her father find themselves caught in a dangerous web of crime when a notorious gang, the Serpents, targets them. The story unfolds as a group of determined bikers, led by Jake, vow to protect the girl and her father from the relentless gang. As the Hell Angels stories unfold, the bikers fight back with everything they've got, taking down the Serpents, destroying their weapon stockpile, and providing a safe haven for the girl and her father. Along the way, they face countless threats and obstacles, but the bond between the bikers strengthens with each challenge. As the girl's father opens up about his past with the Serpents, the bikers strategize their next move to ensure their safety. These Hell Angels stories are filled with high-speed chases, intense battles, and heart-pounding moments, all leading up to the ultimate showdown. With the Serpents closing in, Jake and the crew take a stand, determined to ensure the girl's safety and put an end to the threat once and for all. As the story comes to an end, the bikers emerge victorious, having sent a clear message to the Serpents, and the girl and her father are given the chance for a fresh start. These Hell Angels stories showcase the strength of loyalty, the power of family, and the unwavering determination of a group of bikers willing to fight for what's right.